Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. My name is Julia Chen. I am the Activities Director at the Yale Club, and I'm very excited to welcome you all to our virtual lecture tonight. We've been doing this virtual lecture series where we bring in live speakers to do a talk and a Q&A that you can participate in from the comfort of your homes. Today, we are excited to welcome Professor Frank Snowden. Professor Snowden is a graduate of Harvard College and completed his doctorate at Oxford. After teaching at the University of London, he joined the faculty at Yale, where he served as chair of the program in History of Science and History of Medicine, and he is presently the Andrew Downey Orrick Professor Emeritus of History and History of Medicine. His most recent book, Epidemics and Society, From the Black Death to the Present, was published by Yale University Press in October 2019. His earlier book-length publications relevant to epidemic disease are Naples in the Time of Cholera and The Conquest of Malaria. Epidemics was named Book of the Week by The Guardian and was listed first on the World Economic Forum list of the 5 books to read for the context concerning the coronavirus pandemic. Professor Snowden has given interviews on COVID-19 and its impact relative to other prior pandemics in a variety of forums, including The New Yorker, the Journal of American Medical Association, the Wall Street Journal, PBS, and the Council on Foreign Relations. His most recent experience was that of living in Italy during the earlier months of the pandemic and observing the differences between the American response and that of the countries in the European Union. He joins us today to discuss the question of, will we be forever changed? What is the probable legacy of COVID-19? And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Professor.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you all for joining. What I'd like to do today is to talk rather quickly about the situation in which we find ourselves, where it came from in terms of its comparison with past pandemics, how transformative is it likely to be, and then perhaps afterwards we can talk about where do we go from here, which seems one of the decisive issues that we need to face. The first issue is how impactful have pandemic diseases been in history? Is this, as many journalists have written, unprecedented, and we find ourselves in an entirely new position? Well, here I want to stress that pandemic diseases don't have agency, and they don't have a preconditioned response that they evoke from societies. And so there's an enormous spectrum, and I'd like to contrast two just as background. The first is well known, which is the Plague of Athens, which was written about by Thucydides, who was an Athenian general and also a person who suffered and survived the Plague of Athens. The plague struck Athens at the time of the Peloponnesian War, which was in the microcosm of the classical Greek world, a world war. That is to say, it was Sparta and the allies of Sparta, Sparta, the great authoritarian land power with its allies, versus Athens, the great sea power and its allies. Now, in the 3rd year of the war, a plague broke out in Athens, and Athens was a city that was then its hinterland was ravaged by the invading Spartan army that besieged the countryside, and 150,000 immigrants rushed into the city for safety, so that a city that had been 150,000 swelled and was swollen to 300,000 as its population. Now, it was a pandemic. Thucydides tells us that it perhaps came from Ethiopia. It ravaged Egypt and North Africa. It ravaged Persia, and then it invaded Athens. Now, Athens, we can imagine that this was probably 2 diseases. One was almost certainly typhoid. DNA from pulp, dental pulp of cemeteries have demonstrated that, and quite likely, given the symptoms that Thucydides describes, another disease as well. So in any case, this Plague of Athens, as it's called, lasted for over 2 years. And we know the conditions were exactly right for such an event, which is to say that Athens had terrible conditions of hygiene, and it was an ancestor of typhoid, extremely virulent, and typhoid is transmitted through filth, through contaminated food and water, and that is to say by the oral fecal route. So we now have a city with this vast overcrowding that Thucydides tells us that people were sleeping in the temples, in the streets, everywhere, that sanitation broke down. And so we have a couple of years during which half the population of Athens perished because of the disease. Now, what else do we learn from Thucydides? We learn that this led to the Athenian defeat, that the army was undermined. And so we have what we call today a geopolitical shift in power, which is to say that there was a transformation of the power disparity, hegemony passed to Sparta rather than to Athens. We learn that it transformed Athenian religion because we're told by Thucydides that the Athenians lost their belief in the gods because no matter what sacrifices they made, the war and the disease went no better. And so we also learned that there was a collapse of morality in the city, and that everyone lived for the moment, and people paid no attention to the laws. We learn as well that Thucydides tells us that this was really marked the demise of democracy in Athens. In other words, we have regime change as well. Pericles, who was the great Greek leader and the Democrat who had been there at the outset of the war, is now greatly unpopular. There's a revolt against him, and he, in fact, suffers from the disease as well. Then we learn that there's, and this sounds very modern, there's an outbreak of xenophobia in the city. That is to say, the disease is blamed on those outsiders who came into the city, and Athens, which had always been a very welcoming place to medics, as they were called, those were the outsiders or immigrants, a series of laws are passed that deprive the medics of their citizenship and their rights, and even the rights of their descendants, even if they're born in Athens. So we see a transformation in geopolitics, in regime, in the fall of democracy, a transformation in religion, a transformation in the laws within Athens itself. I then like to look at an opposite case. So everything was transformed by the plague of Athens. At the other end of the spectrum, not all pandemic diseases do that. And strangely enough, it's just not a matter of the body count. The great pandemic, the Spanish influenza of 1918 to 19, was killed perhaps 100 million people and infected every continent except Antarctica and caused countless cases, a caseload that's unimaginable. And yet, if you read the book by Crosby, Alfred Crosby, which talks about the American experience, he titles the book America's Forgotten Pandemic, which is to say that afterwards people wanted to think about something else, put it aside. It's barely mentioned by statesmen. There were very few studies, either by governments or by scholars, after the pandemic until 100 years later, at the centennial, there was this great outburst of retrospective interest in the disease. Now, at the time, there were virtually no memorials. There's only one in Britain to all of the United Kingdom, to any of the heroes, the doctors and nurses who perished during the epidemic, and countless accounts of the war and monuments to the war. Now, why this difference? First, it was that unlike the plague of Athens besieged the city. pandemic influenza kills so many people, makes so many sick, but it passes through communities very quickly and swiftly and then moves on. In addition, because people were preoccupied by other events that were overarching, the war and then the peace coming, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and a wave of the Red Scare immediately after the war. And then during the war, each belligerent country did not want its enemies to know what the dangers and vulnerabilities that they had. And so the press self-censored, and the government of the belligerent countries throughout both sides in the First World War practiced a policy of censorship. This is the reason we call it the Spanish influenza, because Spain was a neutral country. Its press covered the disease extensively. And so if you really wanted to know about the Spanish influenza, you needed to read the Spanish press. So that's the reason. So there we have this extraordinarily deadly disease, lethal throughout the world, and yet it left relatively little mark on the society through which it passed, the opposite end of the spectrum from the plague of Athens. Now, I believe, for reasons I'll be saying, that COVID-19 is closer on the spectrum to the plague of Athens than to the Spanish influenza. And I'd like to say that I would regard COVID-19 as the first major disease of pandemic of the era of globalization. To explain that, what I mean by that, let me make one last comparison, and that is to the great, most dreaded disease of the era of the Industrial Revolution, and contrast that with COVID-19, and that is Asiatic cholera. I believe that a society, that pandemics are so interesting to study because they're like looking glasses which reflect the nature, the structures of a society back to itself. One really gets to see in a pandemic how a society is constructed, what its values are, what its economic system is, how closely what trust there is between people and authorities, what living standards are at the time. Well, in the time of Asiatic cholera, this was a disease of industrialization, by which I mean the early phase of industrial development, when people from the countryside were pouring in to the major cities, places in London and Paris and so on. And there the infrastructure was overwhelmed, as in the time of the plague of Athens, and you have enormous problems of filth and a place of density of housing and overcrowding and no sanitary arrangements at all of these sort of conditions that one can read about in Dickens. So this was a disease of industrialization. Nowadays, we're no longer vulnerable to a disease of that kind because some of its effects include the sanitary revolution, and that meant that we are protected by bulwarks of sewer systems, housing regulations, clean water, the toilet and its connection to sewage, building regulations. Indeed, whole cities were rebuilt. Paris was rebuilt entirely, so was Naples and lots of other cities around the world, the industrial world that is. And it's inconceivable now with the soap bar and all of those sanitary regulations that Asiatic cholera could flourish in New York or New Haven, or indeed Rome. So that is a time that a kind of disease that could no longer occur. COVID-19 is very different. It's a disease of globalization, a new era. And by that, I would say globalization involves a number of components. The first is this extraordinary demographic growth. We now are a global population of nearly 8 billion people, and combined with that, enormous relentless industrial advance throughout the world. And those two together mean the enormous impact on the environment, on our planet. And this causes preconditions for the situation in which we find ourselves today. A first aspect of that is that we have transformed our relationship with the other inhabitants of the planet, that is, other species, with wildlife in particular, and deforestation is particularly important. And the case of bats is directly relevant to COVID-19. And the point is that we've driven animals out of their habitat. And in doing that, and we have invaded it, the habitat, and the result of that is that human beings enter into contact with wild animals that they seldom encountered in the past. And that provides numerous occasions for spillover, that is, for animal diseases and viruses to spill over into the human population. And this is what happened with COVID-19, which is a disease. The virus lives in the reservoir of bats, which are its natural reservoir. They're unaffected by the virus, but when it is transferred to human beings and disseminated amongst them, then we have the disease COVID-19. And it's interesting to note that we have a succession of ever more numerous spillovers from the animal world to human population. That's the story of SARS, the story of MERS, the story of Ebola, the story now of COVID-19. And then in addition, we see that industrialization has caused, as we all know, enormous climate change. And one of the points about that is the greenhouse effect and the gases that are now, and particulate matter that's in the air. And COVID-19 is very able to, part of the vulnerability of human populations is breathing in over a long period of time particulate matter created by air pollution from cars, from factories, and so on. That is another one of our great vulnerabilities. So our relationship with our environment, the natural environment, and the built environment is being transformed by globalization. Another reason, aspect of globalization is not only are we so numerous, but densely populated. And COVID-19, the virus that causes it, is transmitted through the air, and densely populated congregate living and working arrangements, places, are an ideal places for a disease like that to spread person to person, cluster to cluster, exploiting precisely those conditions. Then this happened in Wuhan, and the disease spread perhaps from wild markets, the so-called wet markets in Wuhan, to densely populated housing areas, and then spread from family members one to another to other families who lived nearby. And soon you had community spread throughout the city. In addition, globalization implies extraordinary interconnectedness by airplane. And so if you have a disease that's transmitted in the air and it breaks out, let us say, arbitrarily in Kinshasa or in Jakarta in the morning, it will be with us in New York City, Los Angeles, or London by nightfall. And this then we have created through our networks of exchange economically, of cultural exchange, of tourism, millions of people on airplanes throughout the world. Well, at least we had that until January or February. And this is one of the great pathways that provide a highway for a viral disease transmitted in that way. Another feature of globalization is rampant, as a number of economists have, like Thomas Piketty is a clear example, have been studying the growing, ever-growing inequality within our societies and a large sector of disadvantaged, vulnerable people. And it is COVID-19 thrives on poverty and inequality, and that is something else that we've created. What other conditions have provided a background for COVID-19? We see that it reflects the pathways, like all pandemic diseases. It exploits pathways that we as human beings have created that certain types of organisms are able to exploit. We live in a natural world in which there's almost an infinite number of microbes, and microbes, as Joshua Lederberg, the Nobel laureate, said, have a great advantage over human beings in their infinite number and in the fact that they mutate, that is, they change and adapt to new environmental niches almost instantaneously, whereas we human beings evolve very, very slowly, and we're dependent on our intelligence and our collaboration, one would argue. So these are major areas of vulnerability. I would say as well that there are others. One of them has to do with a cultural factor, which is revolt against science. Or disbelief in science. And we see that here in this country, so many not believing in vaccination. 40% of the American population, we are told, if a vaccine were to be developed, would not accept it. At least that's what polling figures say. It's also true that there's a great disbelief in climate science and a great disbelief in many quarters in the reality of the kind of scientific idea that this is this kind of disease rather than a disease associated with immigrants or with Asians who have been targeted in this period. So this lack of belief in science has made us vulnerable. There's also the very severe problem that this is a disease for which we made no preparedness. So I'd like to talk for a moment about preparedness as part of the background. Since I've talked about globalization, and probably virologists and epidemiologists would date the beginning in microbial terms and disease terms of the era of globalization to about 1997, and the influenza that went pandemic that went around the world in 1997. And after that, virologists said that we are enormously vulnerable to pulmonary viruses. And in 2005, Anthony Fauci, of whom we all know now, testified before the US Congress in which he said that he could make an analogy with meteorology. Meteorologists would tell anyone who lived in the Caribbean that they had hurricanes in their future. The meteorologists couldn't say the date, and they couldn't say how severe they would be, but they would know that they are definitely coming, they're inevitable, and that it would be very advisable to prepare and to take precautionary measures. He said it's exactly the same with regard to pulmonary viral diseases. A pandemic is inevitable, he said, and was supported in this by Julie Gerberding, who was the director then of the CDC, that they said that it's inevitable that a pulmonary pandemic challenge is coming and coming soon. And we can't tell you, they said, the date, and we can't tell you how severe, but it will be a major pulmonary pandemic, and it will be coming in the near future. Well, we had a number of dress rehearsals with SARS. We had them with MERS and with Ebola. And nonetheless, one of the features of this period between 1997 and now is the failure to have prepared. And we can see this in a variety of ways. One, in United States terms, is our fragmented healthcare system, in which we don't actually have a structure for confronting a pandemic emergency because no one in particular is in charge. What we saw is ultimate fragmentation. The president and his advisors say one thing, the governors of the 50 states say something else. There is a cacophony. The mayors and departments of health in cities, school boards all have competing interpretations of the disease and what to do about it. Something that contrasts very starkly with what was happening in some countries, particularly when the European Union. So we had this, and then a global problem was that there was an enormous tendency to take the view that the economy mattered most, and therefore not to spend on healthcare systems, not to establish access to healthcare for everyone, not to adequately fund the World Health Organization or departments of health, that is to say, in countries. In Italy, where I was just living during this pandemic, there had been systematically cuts in spending for health and for scientific research in universities and government labs in the 5 years or so that preceded the outbreak of COVID-19. And one sees exactly the same thing happening in the United States, a systematic defunding of the CDC, of state departments of health, of the structures for leading a national response to the disease. And we see a failure to provide what we might call adequate preparation for, we have a strange paradox. We have some of the best health centers in the world, some of the best scientific and medical research centers in the world, and best trained scientists. We have some of the best laboratories. We have, on the other hand, the gold standard for emergency response internationally, which is the CDC. And yet we find instead that when this disease comes, that the CDC has been unfunded, can't provide tests, that hospitals lack PPE, that is personal protective equipment. They lack surge capacity in terms of beds, of trained personnel, in terms of protocols, in terms of the availability of ventilators and other critical equipment. And so we see this fractured health center was a huge vulnerability that we had. And if we look at, now I would then say that there's also an issue of messaging. And we see in the United States that we had a kind of cacophony of sound with all of the different authorities, each saying something different. It was like a symphony with no director. And this contrasts with I don't want to idealize Italy. It made many mistakes, similar to ones that we have made. But on the other hand, a critical difference is that in Italy, the prime minister went on television and he said, this is a deadly disease. We have only one means, there's no vaccine, there is no therapy. We have only one means of self-defense, and that consists of testing and social distancing, and therefore it's a matter of saving the nation. Patriotism was appealed to, and also this is the only way that this people of Italy, could save their communities, their families, and themselves. And this was supported on television and radio day and night by healthcare vans that went through neighborhoods with loudspeakers, telling people what they had to do in order to protect themselves. You had placards, posters went up on the walls saying what the measures were that needed to be taken. And so we ended up with a situation where I myself waited in lines and heard people saying, oh, this is a national emergency, but this is probably what it was like in World War II. Wasn't this what it was like in the Blitz? We all have to pull together. And the Messaggero, the city newspaper of Rome, printed a very moving article in which it said that this was the first time in 3,000 years of the history of the city of Rome that Italians had ever been obedient. In any case, you have a situation in which there wasn't the resistance, there wasn't the confusion. Italians all knew what they had to do. It was agreed by everybody that this was what you had to do. And so you don't have a resistance to, even though Italy had one of the sternest and most draconian of lockdowns, and it lasted for a couple of months and more, nonetheless, there was an acceptance that this was an inevitability and there was no alternative. So I believe that COVID-19 then, and I'd like to have time for discussion rather than having a long period of my just addressing you, I would say that one other feature that is really critical is that we are threatened also with following in the wake of the physical pandemic. There's likely to be, and has already started, a second pandemic. Dr. Tedros of the World Health Organization had said that the second pandemic is the one of mental health. And weeks and months after COVID-19 has been through a community, it is clear that it has caused enormous amounts of PTSD among healthcare personnel. In Wuhan, China, 50% of the doctors and nurses reported that they were suffering from depression and anxiety. It was causing mental insomnia and other mental ailments. And these two we are not prepared for. The mental component has not been addressed. And doctors and nurses and frontline personnel have not been seen to. And we see that there have been spikes in Britain, the UK, and in this country of substance abuse, of violence in the home, of anxiety, depression, insomnia, and all of these factors. And these, I believe, are likely to be as consequential as the physical issues. So it's with that that I feel that this is the pathway that has brought us where we are. And COVID-19 has spread along pathways that we created through inequality, lack of access to healthcare, lack of belief in science, hotspots like nursing homes, industrial factories, meatpacking, mining, places, the automobile plants, all of that has been, and we know that it's particularly, it follows, that is to say, poverty is inflected with ethnicity in the United States, and so greatly overrepresented are minority groups, African Americans, Latino population, Hispanics, and Native Americans who haven't provided so many figures because they're a small population, but they have been devastated on reservations by COVID-19 as well. So those are the pathways by which it's reached us. I think, therefore, we're confronting a disease which has done something extraordinary, which was to bring the world economy almost to a standstill in an unprecedented way. And that is something that we have not yet been able and will not for a while, I believe, to recover from, absent a vaccine and a therapy. And so we have a transformative disease on the lines of the plague of Athens, not like the Spanish influenza. And perhaps in discussion, we can talk about where we go from here. What are the next years likely to bring us? What about school opening? All of those sorts of issues. But rather than have a monologue, I thought it would be much more fun to have a dialogue. And then at least I'll know that I'll be talking about the issues that you're interested in rather than ones of my own. So I'll stop there and hope that we can talk about other issues. And I do believe I've left you at this moment at a very dark moment. I believe there is also a lot of light. There's silver linings in a very dark cloud. And I think we can talk about that as well.
Thank you so much, Professor. So I feel like the first takeaway is, yes, we will be forever changed. This is just a turning point in our society.
Yes, I believe it's a little bit like the movement of tectonic plates has taken place. And I think that we have shifted. And I think there's no going back to where we were. That does not mean I'm not saying an apocalypse. I'm not thinking that at all. This is not the apocalypse, but it is a fundamental change. It's a situation that we're going to have to adapt to. Microbes don't bargain. They aren't intimidated either, and they respond according to the laws of nature. And so we have to take that into account in our response. And I think we need to put our imaginations together and to devise ways of living with this disease, but that will need enormous change and transformation in almost every aspect of our lives, some of which will actually be positive. I think it's possible at the end of this that we'll live in a world that will be safer for our children and grandchildren. And I, for one, could sign up for that in a heartbeat. So I don't think it's the apocalypse, but we need to, as Joshua Lederberg said, to use our intelligence and our capacity for collaboration.
So we have a question from Michael asking, since you were in Rome at the time, do you feel that the striking public prayers of Pope Francis have had any influence on Romans' disciplined response?
Oh, well, I would say yes. This was yet another example of the value, the essential value and time of a crisis. In times of crisis, whether it be earthquake or flooding or economic recession, the Great Recession or the Great Depression or pandemic, people are terribly frightened. Their moorings, their daily life, that's all been stripped from them. And therefore, they need a sense that trust in authority, that authority knows what it's doing, has a plan, and can provide a sense of direction. And so I think it's very important that you had the papacy putting its own message behind that of the state and saying, yes, this is what needs to be done. And I think people found that very reassuring to have this unified message. And I think that's part of the reason there wasn't the kind of chaos and resistance that we've seen, we're witnessing today in Florida and Texas and sadly. And so, yes, I do believe that European Union countries followed, for the most part, a different path. And I think that has served them well because they have succeeded in flattening the curve. Even countries like Italy that were the worst, was the epicenter of the pandemic at one point. And everyone from the United States that I talked to via Zoom and otherwise was saying, oh my God, you're in Italy. That must be terrible. I think that was the message a while ago, and that was true. But Italy managed by very determined effort and a single direction to flatten the curve, to contain it. And now it also had planned for phased reopening under the guidance of its medical and public health experts. So that is another contrast. That didn't happen here. And so I think that we're suffering from problems in a way, in part of our own making. But in answer to the question, yes, I think the Pope's taking on this disease and saying what he said was very influential as well.
Yeah, I think it's always nice to have that kind of support and that unified message to get behind.
Personally.
Another question from Michael. What, in your view, accounts for the striking disparity of distribution of infections in Italy, where 30% of people and geographic area all in the north accounts for 70% of infections, while the remaining 70 population and geographic in the center and south accounts for only 30%?
Mm-hmm. Right. I think we could say that it was not at all surprising, if one thinks like an epidemiologist, why this disease would emerge first in Lombardy, that is where the capital is Milan, which had the tsunami of cases, the worst emergencies in the hospitals, despite being the wealthiest part of the country. Now, the reason I would say is that Milan was like New York City in our country, in that it's linked, it has two international airports. It's linked by rail and train throughout Europe. It had in the Alps places where lots of people were going skiing with people, the jet set, and it seems as though people, skiers in fact, were people who brought the disease to a number of countries. It is also a place which, because of its wealth, had the most economic interconnectedness with the rest of the world. That is to say, Lombardy is the heartland of Italian industry, and it had enormous exchange, cultural exchanges. Chinese and other European students came to Lombardy. There were links of Italian businessmen and Chinese businessmen going back and forth. There was enormous tourism as well that was part of this center. Another feature is that, again, thinking of New York City, this was Lombardy, and with its center at Milan, this is the most densely inhabited part of the peninsula. And this is a disease, remember, that thrives on dense population, on people crowded together, who come into contact constantly with each other. So from an epidemiologist's point of view, it was entirely logical that Lombardy would be the first place, as New York City was, or perhaps one could say Seattle, which has a similar features on the West Coast, were early affected by the disease. Then something happens that I think was enormously interesting, which is though one would think that perhaps the south of Italy, which is the poorest part of the peninsula, would be the place that the disease would then spread to next. But I think what happened was that the state in Italy was able to successfully, or almost entirely successfully, to contain the disease in the north. Travel was forbidden. People were ordered to stay in their homes and not to go anywhere. For example, where I was living, you were allowed to go outside of your house only to go to a pharmacy or to go to a grocery store. And you had to carry with you a document that was printed and that had your destination and your reason for being outside. And if police stopped you and you were in a place that wasn't consistent with the purpose and the place, your reason for being, you were subject to possible arrest and fines. And large numbers of people were stopped, and there were lots of arrests for that very reason. And so you see, in fact, it was like everyone else, I virtually didn't go outside. Parks were closed. There wasn't anywhere that you could go, in fact. And you couldn't be on the streets at random. You weren't allowed to go outside just to walk. you had to have one of those two purposes. And so I virtually didn't go outside for 2 months. So this was a very severe lockdown, but there wasn't the grumbling because people understood. They thought this is a patriotic act, the staying indoors. It's the way I'm saving my family. It's the way I can protect myself. And that there was also, I think there's been a lot of discussion as to whether only authoritarian regimes could do something like this. I think it's, in a way, not at all true. Here we have a democratic country doing that, and it does so because the prime minister was very clear that he would be held accountable for what happened, that he was democratically removable, and that these were temporary measures that were being adopted. And as soon as the height of the emergency had passed, they would be removed. And he made good on those promises. And soon, not very soon, but after a time of deep sacrifice, it was possible then you could go outside again. Parks were opened as long as you practiced distancing and wore a mask. There was no, everyone I saw outside in this period was wearing a mask. There was no attacking the wearing of masks. In fact, the only violence I heard in the city of Rome was that there was a man who was walking about without a mask. And he was the only person I know of who was attacked. So there was nothing like this country where we hear that healthcare personnel have been threatened and are attacked for trying to protect our nation's health. And that's really tragic and sad to read about. And I think this is created by fractured messaging.
Thank you. So I'm actually going to unmute Richard to ask a question if he still has it.
Oh, thank you. I was very interested in your idea that this pandemic will lead to major changes. I'm wondering how major you think. For example, the world order has been dominated by the existence of nation states for the last couple of 100 years. Do you think that's going to change? That somehow there's going to be a weakening of the nation state system and a emergence of a different world order of something?
Here I'm going to, do the opposite of being a historian, which is to look in my crystal ball. And anything I say, it comes with one great caveat, which is that we're in a very early stage of this pandemic. The disease still we don't know what all of its ramifications to be, how long it's going to last. But let me nonetheless say what I see in the crystal ball, which is, I think in the short term, there will not be the movement that you've said, and that indeed we've seen in many places a strengthening of national barriers. We've seen that the European Union couldn't come together in this crisis with a single policy on an international basis. We've seen that the World Health Organization was not in a position really to provide very effective leadership because it had been underfunded and it didn't have the authority or the powers that it needed to do the job of advising governments throughout the world, providing leadership, information, redistributing resources. It wasn't able to do that very effectively. And we see that we as a country have withdrawn from the World Health Organization, and there seems to be a great deal of upsurge in many places of nationalism, including in our own country. But what I do think is that that's the short and perhaps medium term. But I think we're dealing with nature here. And the problem is that policies of that kind simply are unlikely in epidemiological terms, in resource terms, to work. And so I think that we're going to find that the way to deal with this disease is by collaboration rather than nationalism. And I imagine if we look several years out, we're likely to see a swing in that direction, and a realization that we need a strong WHO, by which I don't mean the WHO that we have, but the WHO that we need. I think that we're going to see much more collaboration within the European Union. Indeed, the European Union is now thinking if the United States is not providing leadership in that direction, they're thinking that perhaps that's what they should be doing. And we see Greece now has the presidency of the Council of Europe, and it's making proposals in those directions. And Germany is also stepping forward in that direction. And so I think that that is part of the way in which there will be changes towards probably more collaboration in the self-interest of everyone. It's not simply asking people to be good, it's asking people to do what's good for them as well.
Thank you so much. And so I'm seeing a number of questions in the chat asking basically about this whole thing that has come up where the government is now telling hospitals that they should send their information not to the CDC, but directly to a different organization. And do you think that the scientists have the responsibility of speaking up against this? What do you think the effects of this will be, especially now that people don't really know who to trust anymore?
I think that it is a terrible thing to think that our government would wish to put a veil over this pandemic and not have people know timely and accurate information. That seems to me what a democracy is all about, and having an informed populace. And so I don't think that this should be something that should be hidden in any way. And I think that provides accountability. And I think that's the basis of trust, ultimately, in time of a pandemic and in times of the kind of problem we were just talking about in terms of mental health. Isn't the worst thing you can do to a population that's afraid to tell them, well, this is actually mysterious as well, and we're not going to tell you about it, and we're not going to tell you how well we're coping or not. I think that's going to create enormous distrust and problems, and that will lead to enormous psychological components that will be very disturbing in our society. And so, yes, I believe that public health personnel should say this, and should say it. Why? Because it's the truth. And I think that what we need to demand of our public health officials and of our political officials is that they level with the country and treat us all as adults in a democracy where we all need to know what is happening, and that orients us, enables us to protect ourselves. Not knowing disarms us and makes us less capable of defending ourselves.
Thank you. So I feel like one of the takeaways is that we want someone to trust, we want that information. I feel like the US has, well, we're now by far the highest cases of infections. And I'm wondering if some of this is because of this lack of trust that we have. And so what can be done about this at this point?
In fact, yes. I think that, again, we may find ourselves moving towards a more central direction. At the state level, we see that governors who began to adopt different policies, they're now beginning to see that we may need to revert to the policies of masking and social distancing. And I think that as this eruption continues, and it looks as though it's going to for some time, and the death toll becomes horrible, the hospital systems are driven to the point of collapse. I think people are going to see that we need a central direction and we need central guidance. And I'm hopeful that that will be a direction in which we will move, driven by a terrible calamity through which we're living at the moment.
So how likely do you think it is that we will have a viable vaccine in the next year? And then, as you mentioned, some people won't even take it. So what do you think will happen in this type of situation?
that is a very murky area, I must say. And I don't want to spread all negativity here because it will be wonderful if a vaccine is developed and it's efficacious and it is widely distributed and people are willing to take it. But I think we have problems on major questions on all of those fronts. One is that we now know that the immunity produced by COVID-19 in its antibodies is not reliable in terms of protecting people and providing them with a long-term immunity. And that may imply that a vaccine will provide very partial immunity rather than being something, it's not likely to be a stand-all panacea that gets us through. There's a lot of magic thinking and wishing for a magic bullet. And it's rare in the history of pandemic diseases that there is a vaccine that is like the smallpox vaccine. That is unusual, and I don't think that people should be promised that something like that is right on the horizon, because we don't know that. And then we have the issue, what will be the means of distribution of this? We don't know. Will it be possible to produce it in the enormous quantities that will be needed? And will there be the personnel that will be able to distribute it and administer it? And then what happens if, in fact, there's a huge anti-vaccine movement and people motivated by distrust refuse to take it? And so those are major problems. And I think it would be wonderful if we do get a vaccine, if one had the director of the CDC and the president of the United States, whoever it was, and religious leaders came together and said, this is necessary for the safety of everyone. Let us have this as our major effort and policy to defend our nation and our families. I think if that could happen, that would be an extremely different climate from the present one, but that may in fact be the direction we move in the medium term. In the short term, I'm gloomy. In the medium term, I'm anxious. And the longer term, I feel there are reasons for considerable optimism.
So are there historically any patterns that show us that we can expect the end of the pandemic? Because I've also saw some interviews early on in this where scientists said that might become endemic. This might just never be eliminated from the population, or just become less dangerous over time. Do you have any viewpoints on all of that?
Yes, the first is to say that no one can tell you what the future of COVID-19 will be with any certainty. On the other hand, what is as the pathophysiology of COVID-19 is being explored, it turns out that this really is an extraordinarily complex disease that affects many, many different bodily systems, that is much more easily transmissible than was originally thought, and therefore seems to be very well adapted to the kind of world that we've created. And therefore, I don't see the likelihood of eradicating this disease in any near future that I can imagine. And it seems that it's likely the response is containment rather eradication. And that means reimagining our cities, reimagining ways of work, reimagining ways of travel, of producing goods and services. And I think that's the direction in which we're likely to go. And we can see in the European Union that a city like Milan is already thinking of reimagining itself as a place with broad boulevards, with huge pavements, so that on the sidewalk, people can go shopping and practice social distancing at the same time, that there will be broad lanes for bicycles so that people won't take crowded subways so much, especially on a flat city. So it's like Manhattan in that way. And that could actually happen in a city like Milan. And lots of cities are now thinking also about reconfiguring their buildings. So there'll be more ventilation, there'll be more space, that people will not be congregated together in the same ways. So there won't be these hot spots where the disease can thrive. And so I think that human ingenuity can actually address this problem, and we don't have to all succumb to COVID-19. It will be possible to live with it and to make that part of the way we reimagine our cities and our working life. But it means a tectonic shift and a real change in the way we do business, are educated. We're talking about the Yale Club, and I do indeed believe that universities have a role to play in reimagining how they do their business. And once again, this isn't apocalyptic. I believe that Yale is going to survive, as most of us are, and that it's just that we'll be changed, I guess is what I'm saying.
Great. So the next question I was actually going to ask based on a couple questions was, where do you think we can find that balance between being safe from the disease, but also not, say, destroying the economy, making it very difficult for parents by not reopening up schools? It sounds like that's kind of your answer, though. It's basically we need to change the system.
I think there are areas of our life, our common life, that do need transformation. I think the healthcare system is one. I think it hasn't served us well in this pandemic, and it isn't designed to do so. And so that needs to be really fundamentally rethought. I think that there are lots of other, I think we can't simply go back to a lot of areas in the service sector. I think we need new ways of having restaurants, much more outdoors, much more carefully spaced, ventilated, lots of testing. I don't think that means that restaurants all have to be shuttered forever. I don't think it means workplaces need to be redesigned so that the workforce is protected. Workforces need to be tested as well. That needs to be part of our future. Schools, I don't take the position that schools need to be shut for good. I, in fact, think that there are enormous health consequences, psychologically, developmentally, and indeed, so many children depend on schools for their nutrition and all sorts of, for their social development, as well as their education. I'm actually a fan of reopening schools, but only under certain circumstances. You can't do that in a place where there's a huge upsurge of disease. You must contain it first. And I think the European Union is doing that. They've contained the disease first, and then they reopen, but they reopen according to a plan and redesigning classrooms, methods of instruction. That's the way I see we're going, not calling to an end to our economic, cultural, and educational life. I'm not gloomy in that way at all. I'm thinking this calls on imagination, a use of our intelligence to have both our education and our economy, and also our physical safety from what is a deadly disease. And I think all of that is possible, but not by going back to trying to revive everything just as it was. We have to make changes so that we can adapt and live with this and make sure that we keep it carefully contained, to keep the genie back in its box. And I think that that can be done, but only if we make science, if we listen to science and take a rational, coordinated, singly directed response to doing that.
So hopefully this is a more positive question, but are there any examples of historical leaders who have created positive changes in their societies in the aftermath of a pandemic?
Absolutely, yes. I would say that, and that's part of my reason for optimism. I believe that this is not an unprecedented situation. Let me give a very clear example, which I was talking briefly about the 19th century and Asiatic cholera, the most feared disease of the century. And in the UK, it had wreaked enormous havoc. The aftermath, though, was the establishment of a central board of health, which retrofitted every city in Britain with a sanitary infrastructure. And this was at enormous expense. Imagine every city in Britain suddenly having safe water, which it had never had, having a sewage system, which that had all to be built in bricks and mortar under the streets. You also had new housing regulations. That is, there were regulated density and the material constructor, whitewashing outside, and the paving of the streets. So and then there was the diffusing of personal habits, the habit of cleanliness, the use of bars of soap. So it moved indoors as well as outdoors, and we see new regulatory authorities being used by the state to keep us safer, and we have even indeed new illegal transformation as a result of this. And I would say that this was a very positive step. And I would say we are forever transformed. We're forever changed as a result. And what our daily habits of ablutions are the gift of the sanitary movement, and our housing regulations are as well. And the water that we drink and the sewage system that we use is all part of the sanitary revolution. And so we were transformed then in a positive direction. And we are never vulnerable again. This Asiatic cholera has not been eradicated. It still exists in the world, but it will never again break out as a massive danger in New York City. And that is now pretty much a certainty. And I would like to see something analogous done with COVID-19, that we need to transform, but in a positive way, and then the world will be safer for our grandchildren. That's the objective.
Wonderful. So I guess our last question would be, what advice do you have for, say, world and community leaders and for the average person right now?
I think I would have the advice that we need to believe in reason and science, and we need to make use of public health in a constructive way. We need to listen to public health officials, and we need to insist that our political authorities make use of the best possible scientific advice in devising public policy in the field of health, because that's a scientific matter. And I don't think that scientists should be in charge of implementing those measures. We don't need to put scientists in charge of everything, but I think we need to listen to their reason, that is to say, robust evidence-based science that demonstrates the masking issue is an example. And if we have a vaccine, we need to persuade the public that this is scientifically tested, it's safe, it's critical that we adapt it. And I would say then, I hope that the American people, my advice is we need to be much more willing to listen to science and to follow its dictates, because this isn't a matter of politics. This is a matter of reason and experience and experiment that have all gone. It's making rational use of our intelligence as human beings. That is what I think we need to do in a concerted way, and to insist that our elected policymakers do that as well.
Thank you. Like you said, it is not the end of the world, and looks like there is cause for optimism. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Me too. So
Great. Thank you so much,
so much.
Professor. This was wonderful.
I've enjoyed being with you.
Great. And thank you everybody for attending. We have lots of upcoming events. Be sure to check out the online calendar, and I hope to see you at one of them again soon. Until then, stay safe, stay connected. We'll see you next time.